This presentation examines teacher-based teams and their role in the Ohio improvement process. It explores the purposes of such teams and the challenges they confront in their work to improve educational outcomes for all students. I am Amy Howley, Professor Emerita from Ohio University's Patton College of Education. In various institutions over the years, I have served as an intervention specialist, Director of Special Education, Professor of Special Education, Professor of Educational Administration, Department Chair, and Associate Dean. By viewing this presentation, an educator or educator candidate will gain greater awareness of the purposes of teacher-based teams, the challenges they face, and strategies that teacher-based teams can use to address those challenges. Let's start off with a brief statement of the purpose of teacher-based teams in Ohio. The purpose of these teams is to support collaboration among teachers as they review relevant data in order to make wise instructional decisions, implement instructional changes, and evaluate the effectiveness of those changes. Unpacking the meaning of the key terms and phrases in the description of the purpose of teacher-based teams will contribute to deeper understanding of what these teams are and what they do. The important terms and phrases are collaboration, relevant data, instructional decisions, implement instructional changes, and evaluate the effectiveness of those changes. Interestingly, each important term or phrase points to a challenge that teacher-based teams face. That's because the processes that define the work of these teams are often complex and difficult, and sometimes they cause conflict, but the payoffs for performing them well are high. The first important term is collaboration. Collaboration involves working together to accomplish a common purpose. What might be the major challenges associated with collaboration? Educators who seek to collaborate in order to improve instruction, like other colleagues who seek to collaborate, face several significant challenges. These include building trust, maintaining focus, reaching consensus, and committing to action steps. Among the challenges, I'd place building trust at the top of the list. Trust involves our belief that other people, those whom we trust, have our best interests at heart. Such a belief provides an important foundation for the work needed in order to improve instruction, because this work requires teachers to self-disclose about lessons and instructional methods that don't work. And most people find it difficult to share stories about less effective practices, their so-called failures, with anyone other than trusted friends and colleagues. Trust, moreover, can be built in some organizations much more readily than in others. In a culture of competition, where teachers are pitted against one another, building trust is much more difficult. Trust building depends on a culture in which team success is rewarded at least as much, and maybe even more, than individual success, and in which making mistakes is treated as an integral part of the learning process. Maintaining focus is another challenge to collaboration. Effective teacher-based teams devote almost all of their energy to the tasks associated with instructional improvement and spend much less time socializing. Maintaining such single-minded focus is difficult in schools where teachers spend most of their time with children and adolescents. For many teachers, the need for adult conversation and friendship is keenly felt. For many teachers as well, school district organizations are bewildering places, and talking about what's going on with new policies, employment decisions, community dynamics, and so on helps teachers make sense of their work environment. Unfortunately, with time for collaboration at a premium, these conversations can crowd out crucial discussions about student learning and the instructional practices that will improve learning. In order to act in concert, the teachers on a teacher-based team must reach consensus about the nature of the learning problems they are observing and how to address those problems. Often their analyses and recommendations differ. After all, the data informing their judgment often require interpretation, and different perspectives lead to different interpretations. Reaching consensus depends on a process of deliberation in which the team considers all perspectives but narrows down its choices to one or two action steps. Deliberation of this sort involves and, according to some, even requires conflict, and many people are uncomfortable with conflict. Learning to use conflict productively to support more thorough and well-reasoned decisions is a critical need in most teams. One other significant challenge that teams face is the tendency for people to agree in word but not in deed. Follow-through is a major problem in all lines of work, but follow-through is absolutely necessary if change is to occur. For teacher-based teams, the agreement to take a particular action must be viewed as sacrosanct, as a covenant. In other words, teachers on the team need to believe that their failure to take the agreed-upon action will have serious consequences for their continuation as full and valued members of the team. Teacher teams, however, have limited ability to sanction uncooperative members, and even using the sanctions at their disposal can feel very uncomfortable. Nevertheless, with a high degree of focus on the work needed to improve learning, teacher-based teams can find the resolve to hold all members accountable to the team. To observe views about the value of teacher-based teams among educators in one school district, the Worcester City Schools, please watch the video on the next slide.
For so many years, so many people have wanted to not change what they do. But eventually they have to see that if it's what you're doing is not working, then we need to try something else. And this is exactly what we needed. It's student driven, student directed, and people are changing their philosophy about what school's about. It's not about me as the teacher and what I like to do and how I think I like to teach. It's about the student and how am I going to reach them and reach their needs. And I think TBT is really helping us focus on that. And those who might not be so on board are now coming on board because they're seeing that we're getting results, and this is the way to go.
It's definitely a process. I mean, if I look at where our teams were a year ago today, nothing like it looked like today. I mean, absolutely nothing. And I know that because like this year I'm working with my science and social studies really in depth with the 5-step process for the first time. And you can see a great difference between the two teams only because, a year's worth of working with the process and really looking at that data. So I think as you do this, I think you need to differentiate within your TBTs.
As a general ed teacher, I know that this has taken the focus off of the whole group and down to the actual individual student. We know exactly, looking at their data, exactly who needs what. And the TBT allows us to gather together, put that information together, and then use each other as a resource to find out how am I going to get to this specific child's needs. And it's totally different from the way we used to do it. It used to be, okay, well, everybody teaches this in 4th grade, you teach it, you assess it, you never see the assessment again, you move on to the next thing. And now we're seeing that we're really student specific. We know exactly who they are, and what they need, and we are meeting those needs based on what's coming out of TBT.
TBT process allows them to collaborate with their colleagues on basically instructional issues that they face on a daily basis, whether kids achieving or not achieving, whether they need to go back and revisit some of the instruction that they've already provided for students that maybe the students didn't understand the first time around, possibly re-rostering kids and collaboratively working together to maybe to keep everyone moving in the right direction, so that we don't leave student achievement gaps in with students that that don't get it maybe the first time around. So it is definitely a collaborative process, and we're finding that it really helps our kids that struggle at times.
I would also look at that collaboration piece in that inclusion model, where our teachers are so closely working together that it's providing such a nice team for them to be able to look at data, share data, and make improvements in student achievement.
The instruction has changed because now it's driven by the data. And we look and see, are we focusing on the right things? Are we focusing on what the students need, or are we focusing on what we think they need? This data drives what we do because now we know what they need.
There's an intervention specialist basically in every grade level, and they sit with that TBT. A little different in our 6A, we have 2 resource room teachers, and then we also have 2 that are inclusion. So they sit in with the grade level, most of who they may have in that. And then they provide interventions for either the classroom teachers or the classroom teachers. A lot of times what is nice is it can help us with our kiddos that are in the resource room. One of the tricky things with children on IEPs is, we already understand that they have some deficits, but yet they're held to the same curriculum understanding. So how do we close that gap in between? So the conversation that happens between the gen ed teachers and our intervention specialists is priceless, just trying to close that gap and taking some strategies that are there and some strategies that we have and blend them together. And that happens at our TBTs as well. So I'm going to say with the introduction of TBT, I think the expectation for our students with disabilities or on an IEP is definitely raised. We've definitely raised the bar for all of them. And I think the focus is now that all kids can do this, and they will do it. And just because they're on an IEP or they have special needs, that's not a crutch or a way just to get out. It's okay because they're on an IEP. So definitely our bar has been raised for our kids here.
The idea of bringing a child to the IET process, the mentality was that it would end in testing. It was always, if you bring a child to team, it's going to end in a testing. And I think that philosophy has changed here as well. Mm-hmm. We're bringing children to team to get ideas on interventions and what we can do in the classroom. We're not looking for that end result of getting them tested. And for the longest time, you would get teachers who would not even fill out the paperwork and get it started unless they thought that child was going to be tested at the end. And now it's more about meeting that child's needs and finding out what they need and what support we could get from the IET process, not looking to get them tested.
These are kids, and we just need to work with kids. And if this is your student, the label, it doesn't matter. What are we going to do differently, whether you have a piece of paper or not? So we worked very hard here at this building to get that philosophy, and I can definitely see that it is changing. And it goes back to they're kids. They're somebody kids. This is as a mother, that's what I would want from. What are we going to do differently? And that's all we need to know. Okay, I kind of kid with them like, okay, here's an IEP. It's sitting in front of you. So what are you going to do differently now? Mm-hmm. So that is our philosophy here. No longer is it just what are we going to do differently? Mm-hmm. How are we going to differentiate? What are we going to do to make this kid successful here? Mm-hmm. So. We're trying to really get away from that philosophy of we go to team to test. Mm-hmm. Because it's just not the way we operate anymore. Mm-hmm.
The second important phrase in the description of the purpose of teacher-based teams is relevant data. What might be the major challenges associated with gathering, analyzing, and interpreting relevant data? Effective data use is at the very heart of data-based instructional decision-making, but there are numerous challenges confronting teacher teams as they look to find, generate, analyze, and interpret relevant data. There's a phrase from computer science that has particular applicability whenever anyone thinks about database decision-making. The phrase is, garbage in, garbage out. In other words, the decisions one makes on the basis of data are only as useful as the data themselves. If the data are imprecise or irrelevant, they are likely also to be misleading. Teacher teams need to pay particular attention to two issues related to their data. First, are their data relevant? And second, are they interpreting their data correctly? With respect to relevance, data are meaningful only when they address the right question, come from valid and reliable sources, and are sufficiently focused to paint a clear picture. These conditions are not tremendously difficult to meet, but often the data that educators have available to them fail to meet these conditions. Furthermore, schools are busy places, and adding the careful use of data to the job expectations of teachers and administrators introduces new challenges to already challenging roles. The next slides provide some examples of the challenges that educators face when they try to use data well. First, teachers and teacher teams need to ask and answer the right questions. We might call these research questions. Notably, they need to ask questions that the data have the ability to answer. For example, the temptation to try to answer questions about cause and effect is very great. Educators want to know if the strategies they are using cause improved learning. But only certain data, generated using specialized research techniques, can really answer questions about cause and effect. Often, in practice, teachers and teacher teams need to ask more modest questions, such as questions about the association between the use of a strategy and trends in the performance of students, individual students, certain groups of students, or the class as a whole. Second, the data most readily available to educators also incorporate significant limitations. State achievement tests, for instance, do not have enough items to provide information about students' mastery of specific skills. More targeted, curriculum-based assessments are needed in order to answer questions about the mastery of specific skills. Curriculum-based assessments, however, may or may not be technically adequate, in other words, both valid and reliable. And the development of technically adequate tests is a painstaking process. Few teachers or teacher teams have time even to pilot test the assessment instruments they use in order to ensure their technical adequacy, let alone to perform the multiple steps needed to develop valid and reliable measures. Finally, recent trends emphasizing data-based decision-making may actually result in the proliferation of data, a condition that puts so much data in the hands of teachers and teacher teams that they have a hard time determining the data points, that is, the indicators, that are most significant. Data also need to be interpreted accurately in order to be useful as a guide to instructional decisions. Two quick examples illustrate this point. First, think about a teacher team that relies on average scores only as a way to interpret improvement. Average scores do allow teams to see overall trends, but they may obscure variability in how different groups of students are performing. Notably, if averages increase while at the same time variability also increases, the overall upward trend may obscure troubling subgroup differences. After all, it's possible to see increasing average scores when the highest performers start to make progress, even though lower performers stagnate or lose ground. In this case, by not looking at variability as well as averages, the team may fail to see an important trend pertinent to their instructional practices. Second, Teams may think they see trends that actually are not there. Take the example of classrooms with very small numbers of students. In these classrooms, apparent ups and downs in performance can reflect circumstances with little instructional import. If one student fails the math test because he or she has the flu, for instance, the whole class may appear to be declining in performance. The decline in performance may look startling, but because of the small numbers of students, it actually is trivial. Removing the one student's score from the distribution may reveal a quite different picture, one that turns out, in fact, to be more accurate. The third important phrase in the description of the purpose of teacher teams is wise instructional decisions. What are wise instructional decisions? What might be the major challenges associated with making wise instructional decisions? As you can imagine, there are many challenges associated with making wise instructional decisions. Wisdom is, of course, a very high bar. Teacher teams start the process of making wise instructional decisions from the vantage point of their prior knowledge. Such knowledge might allow a teacher-based team, for instance, to develop a list of instructional strategies that have the potential to be effective. The next step after generating the list of promising strategies is to examine the research evidence for each of them. Many useful syntheses of relevant research can help teachers pull together the information they need. In addition to an understanding of the likely efficacy of an instructional practice, teacher-based teams also need deep understanding of school dynamics in order to make a judgment about whether or not that practice will resonate with the staff capacities, the organizational culture, and the community makeup of a particular district. For example, both Saxon Math and Connected Math show promise based on evidence reported by the United States Department of Education's What Works Clearinghouse. But Saxon Math tends to be a bit more traditional than Connected Math. In many communities, parents might feel more comfortable with Saxon Math, but in some communities, the opposite might be the case. With knowledge about the typical efficacy of a strategy combined with knowledge about local context, a team can narrow down a list of evidence-based practices to just one or two strategies with potential to foster significant improvements. Even if these two considerations, the research evidence and understanding of the local context, point to the likely effectiveness of a strategy, it won't work if teachers are unwilling or unable to use it. Teachers in a particular school might be more receptive to or more adept with certain strategies, and those strategies may be more feasible to implement than others. For this reason, it's important for some of the most effective teachers on a team or in a school to test out a strategy to see if they can make it work before asking all teachers on the team or in the school to adopt the strategy. The fourth phrase that helps us unpack the description of the work of teacher-based teams is implementing instructional changes. What might be the major challenges associated with the process of implementing instructional changes? As we all know, change is not easy for anyone. Several specific features of the change process make it particularly challenging. One of the most significant challenges associated with the process of implementing instructional changes with fidelity involves overcoming our own resistance to change. Just about all of us become set in our ways and therefore feel threatened, at least to some degree, by actions that require us to change. Of course, some people are early adopters of change and others late adopters, a circumstance suggesting that change, while difficult for everyone, is more difficult for some people than others. Because change is difficult, support for change needs to be robust, consistent, and available for a relatively long period of time. Another challenge associated with the process of implementing an instructional change is the difficulty in establishing precise, specifications about what the change involves. If the change relates to reading instruction, for example, the teacher team might decide to implement a strategy that they describe as, quote, using more guided reading, unquote. But what does guided reading really entail? And how much more does the team mean by the word more? Implementing the change would be easier if the team were more specific, saying something like this, quote, we will use guided reading 3 times a week for 30 minutes each time by assigning passages at each student's instructional reading level with 4 questions that the student will read prior to reading the passage to help him or her anticipate what he or she will be reading, unquote. This type of specification, or what some call operationalization, is needed to enable educators to implement changes with fidelity, that is, according to plan. It's hard to implement anything with fidelity if the plan is vague. This slide shows the difference in the 2 ways of describing the illustrative change in reading instruction. Note how much more detailed and behavioral the second statement is, in contrast to the first. Yet another challenge associated with implementation is what Michael Fullen calls the implementation dip. This challenge relates to the fact that when an instructional change is first implemented, achievement or behavior often gets worse before it gets better. Improvement happens only after the teacher becomes proficient with the new strategy, students have adjusted to new routines, and the strategy has had sufficient time to achieve its intended effect. Often educators abandon changes when they observe the implementation dip, but the dip is actually an encouraging sign. Patience typically pays off if teachers persist in using the innovation through and beyond the implementation dip. The final phrase in the description of the work of teacher-based teams talks about evaluating the effectiveness of instructional changes. What might be the challenges associated with evaluation of this type? Evaluating the effectiveness of an instructional strategy is another serious challenge that teacher teams face. Answering the question, is this instructional strategy effective? Or the similar question, does this instructional strategy promote improved learning? Turns out to be a bit tricky. First of all, teachers may not be using assessments with sufficient precision to tell whether or not there is marked improvement. Sufficiently precise assessments include a large enough number of items to sample performance in each part of the instructional domain. Second, teachers rarely have the luxury of testing twice, before instruction and then again after instruction, in order to gauge growth. Teacher teams often compare performance on the test covering the content of one unit with performance on the test covering the content of another unit. Because the content differs and the tests differ, the comparison is not likely to be valid. It's what's meant by the phrase, comparing apples with oranges. Even when tools are sensitive and teachers or teacher teams measure growth, not just post-instruction performance, their determination of the effectiveness of an instructional strategy may be compromised by their inability to compare performance or growth in performance across groups, one receiving instruction via the new strategy and one receiving instruction via the old strategy. Perhaps, with some instructional content, any instructional method, not just the newly adopted strategy, would promote high performance or a lot of growth. Or perhaps something unrelated to the newly adopted strategy, such as a change in the school's homework policy, would be likely to produce an achievement gain. Without a comparison group, a teacher or team of teachers might incorrectly conclude that growth and achievement resulted from the use of the new strategy rather than from something else, such as the ease of the material or another condition influencing students' learning. Despite the extra steps involved in using comparison groups, it's an approach that teacher teams ought to consider when they want to be sure that a new instructional strategy is actually working as intended. The team approach can make this process simpler. For example, if a teacher team includes 4 teachers overall, 2 of the teachers could implement a new strategy while 2 others retain the old strategy. Then the team can compare results across classrooms and decide to continue with the strategy that appears to work best. Despite the challenges, the practice by teacher teams of using data to support instructional decision-making does contribute to improvement in educational outcomes. It also makes teaching more rewarding. Even though teachers over the years have accepted the norm of teaching in isolation, isolation is not a good context for effective instruction. And isolation detracts from job satisfaction. Partly it does so because people are generally social, and working with others is therefore more enjoyable than working alone. Partly, and more importantly, it detracts from job satisfaction because it limits the extent to which teachers can work together in common purpose to achieve worthwhile goals. Thanks to a couple of online sources for photographs that do not have copyright restrictions, and thanks to all of you who have continued with this presentation to its conclusion.